Thanks for that. Now, I've got Phoebe here who's actually just going to make a handout just of the actual standards itself, because it's much too small and detailed to actually put up on the screen, and I'd like to refer to it later. So I've actually, on this opening slide, just put in the entire title of the project actually, but in the seminar announcement we actually used AG LTAS, which is really Learning and Teaching Academic Standards for Agriculture, which is what I'll talk about today, but I don't think I'll probably take the full 45 minutes, I think, given it's a Friday afternoon. Okay, so first up, I just want to acknowledge the team, and it is pretty wide, diverse team, and there's about 19 of us actually working on this project. Those with stars are actually in our reference group, who you can see are a mixture of academics and a student actually, who's Nisha down here, and a couple of people from industry who are working with us on the project, and the remainder are all actually part of the project team and have worked pretty hard over the last 9 months to actually get to this first, to the document that you can actually see here today. We've also got an external evaluator, given that the project's funded by the Office for Learning and Teaching, and they expect us to have evaluation embedded throughout the project. You can see most of us here. This photo was just taken, when was it? It was back in May, yep, at our project meeting that we had over in Melbourne. I'd just like to point out a couple of people here. Phoebe, who's just down here in the front. So Phoebe's our project manager, and whom I would not be able to do this project without. She's been fantastic. And also people like Joe has also been very instrumental in helping with the development of a curriculum mapping tool that I'll mention later on. Okay, so I just thought I'd put up the project aims, and given that we've got a rather small but diverse audience, I will need to just step out, I think, some of the terminology that's used, just so that we can understand the background and all be on the same page. Okay, so as you can see here, what we're aiming to do is actually to develop nationally agreed, so this is very much a national project, threshold learning outcomes, and take them from science and actually adapt it into our own discipline of agriculture. Now, to do this, we've needed to go out and actually talk with a whole different range of people to get their input. And so this is industry, and it's great to see a couple of people here from industry, so to speak, this afternoon. Academics, students, and also the Australian Council of Deans of Agriculture have quite an important role to play in this project, in that as the, I guess, peak body for the discipline in tertiary education, their role has actually been to support, or officially support, I guess, the learning and teaching academic standards that we've handed out to you today. And now we've actually mostly completed this first part of the project already, and today I'll also touch on some of our preliminary results that we've had for benchmarking the academic standards in the different universities, but just starting our own university. We've just done this very recently, and it'd be great to be able to show you some of this preliminary information. Now, I just need to unpack some of those different terms because, like I said, we've got a fairly mixed audience here today. So I guess the first one is threshold learning outcomes. What do we actually mean by that? I think learning outcomes is a fairly obvious kind of term to get your head around. Obviously, we're talking about what a graduate would know, understand and do when they actually get to the end of their degree and graduate. Okay. Now, some of this work already started actually back in 2010, where several disciplines were actually provided funding through what was then the Australian Learning and Teaching Council, which has since moved into being the Office for Learning and Teaching. In particular, two very well-respected professors here, Sue Jones and also Brian Yates, who developed the Learning and Teaching Academic Standards for Science. Okay, so that was a project that took them a year. They travelled a lot around Australia, talking to a lot of different people about what the discipline actually thought was important in terms of learning outcomes for graduates. And since then, there's also been, as you can see here, we've just got 4 of the booklets down here, but in many of the different disciplines, there's also been this activity as well. It's everything from economics through to vet, which was included in with medical science and things like this. Now, threshold. What do we mean by threshold? I guess if we think about learning outcomes, many of us are marking exams at the moment. I can see a few academics here. And when we're marking exams, we're thinking of standards, aren't they? Is it a pass? Is it a HD? Unfortunately, is it a fail, which we prefer not to see? But when it comes to something like learning outcomes for graduate, what we're really talking about is a pass level student, because at the end of the day, they're the people who can actually get a testament and graduate and finish up. Okay, we'd much prefer them to actually be graduating with HDs or something like this, but at the end of the day, it is a pass level that we need to target, at least in for these standards. Okay, so why now? Why this big focus on standards? It sounds like a really dry subject, but personally, I find it really interesting, but that's just me. So, with each of the disciplines, they actually have the opportunity at the moment to set their own standards. So rather than the standards being set by, say, government and being told you will work towards these standards and here they are, we really need to take it back to the discipline and ask the discipline what they actually think is important, because they know their own discipline really well and they have the contacts with industry and with students to be able to develop these standards. And in our case, that's involved broad consultation with the agriculture sector. Now, if we then think about what happens within universities and in terms of quality assurance, as I mentioned, many of us are marking exams at the moment. Many of us would have also received messages about how many students have completed evaluate forms and things like this at the moment. So there's a lot of measurement around quality and us being able to demonstrate, I guess, as teachers, what kind of quality or standard that we meet in our teaching as well. So we've got things like evaluate. Within a unit, we've got learning outcomes that we need, or we're hoping that the students will actually be able to achieve. Push that to the upper level, and we've got things like course learning outcomes that we need to actually try to write to be able to articulate to students what it is that we want them to actually know, understand and do when they finish their degree. Go up another level, and actually, if you think about it, we've got students who come here and pay their hard-earned money to actually undertake study. We've also got the government who also pays us money for students to be able to come here and study as well. Both of them actually need to know that what we're doing is actually meeting some minimum standards. And so there's regulatory bodies that are also really interested in what we do. And a couple of them, there's one called the Higher Education Standards Panel. Okay, what they do, they set these course design and learning outcomes. They actually set a lot of other standards as well, but this one is the one that I'm in particular interested in this seminar. You've also got another organisation called TEXA, who you might have heard of. Okay, so the Tertiary Education Qualification Standards Association. Okay, now they are the ones who come out here to the uni and actually, in effect, auditors. Okay, against these standards, against what we've said that we've been able to do. So some of this drive for being able to set standards is actually in response to this quality assurance framework and discussion that's happening nationally, and it's happening in each different university. Okay. Now, in terms of being able to respond to these standards for course design and learning outcomes, there's actually 3 reference points that I've actually just highlighted there in red, that the standards panel actually considers as useful in being able to demonstrate that the university meets the standard in a particular discipline. One of those is the Australian Qualification Framework. Okay, that's all that's doing is just basically saying that there are qualifications for, say, a bachelor level. They're fairly generic. Okay, they certainly don't go into any detail at the discipline level. There are some disciplines, such as engineering, who comes to mind, who actually have professional accreditation associated with their degrees. Okay, if you're a newly qualified engineer, you actually need to have accreditation before you can go out and practice. We don't have that in agriculture. But the other aspect that the Higher Education Standards Panel has said that is appropriate to use are learning outcome statements that are generated by the disciplines. And this is where the Ag LTAS project comes in, okay, and also other ones like the science and other various disciplines. And so this has been recognised as an appropriate way of being able to measure standards. Now, the other part of that is that there's also some push, I guess, to be able to demonstrate that we meet these standards through external benchmarking. Now, I know this is a conversation that's happening in the university, and I don't believe we've taken too many steps in that particular framework at the moment, at least in agriculture. Having said that, some of the group of 8 universities, and also I think it's for accounting and business studies, are actually starting to do some external benchmarking through blind benchmarking across different universities. So that's something in the future that we need to think about. Okay, so there's a lot obviously going on in this national regulation sort of space. But if we bring it back to our own discipline, we've also got some other issues at the moment. There's a well-recognised current skills shortage in agriculture. Okay, there's also been several government-based inquiries into higher education and skills. So it's very topical for us at the moment. So it's a great time for us to be actually having conversations amongst ourselves as academics, but also with industry and with the students, to think about what it is in our discipline that we actually value in terms of our graduates when they finish with our degrees. Okay. Rightio. So I guess the other question in amongst all of that is why UTAS? Okay, why are we leading this project? Well, I guess some of this actually goes back a couple of years now. I mentioned Sue Jones and Brian Yates. You know, after they'd finished their discipline project for science, they ended up doing another project within the Faculty of Science, Engineering and Technology, where they wanted to actually map the threshold learning outcomes for science. And at the time, they were interested in, well, how might this look for agricultural science, given that this, at least in our university, is a specialised degree, and would the outcomes be slightly different? And it was at this point that I got involved in this project, along with other people such as Peter Lane and Greg Hannon, who was then Associate Dean, and Joe Kelder, who's also in this project now. Now, a couple of academics in the audience might remember that, you know, a couple of years ago we got together, we had a chat about what we actually thought a graduate in our ag science degree should actually know, understand and do when they finished. Now that kind of grew from there. We had interest also from Charles Sturt University and the University of Adelaide, and between us all we had about 26 people who in the end participated in this either through commenting on an early draft of a learning and teaching academic standards statement or through workshops. Now, but they were just academics. Okay, so there was no buy-in at that point in time from industry or the students, and it was really quite narrow. What we found at the time was that the threshold learning outcomes, which captured things like knowledge, understanding, you know, inquiry and problem solving, professional, personal responsibility, but also this TLO around vocational knowledge at the time. There was a little bit of tension around that. Some people thought, yeah, that was a great idea. Other people thought, no, maybe not. Maybe that's not really what a university is about. So, you know, it was great. It was a pilot project, but it kind of set the scene for the next stage of the project where we applied for funding from the Office for Learning and Teaching. And it also meant that we had, or wanted to explore really, whether this vocational knowledge was an appropriate kind of TLO to have by the time we actually expanded this consultation out to industry and other academics and other universities, and also the students themselves. So what we proposed to do with the project for the Office for Learning and Teaching was to develop nationally agreed Ag LTAS statement. So that includes these two components, the nature and extent of agriculture, so what the discipline actually is, and the statements themselves. Okay, so that meant that we could actually have this discussion using you know, a common framework about standards in the universities that taught agriculture nationally. Another thing is, because we've met and talked about this, and it can actually potentially give students confidence about what the minimum standards are for their degree. But at the same time, just to emphasise that we're not actually taking a cookie-cutter approach to course learning outcomes, okay? It will always be suited towards whatever niche the particular university is looking at, okay? It's a real opportunity for academics and industry to really talk about standards and learning outcomes in particular of graduates. There can be, and there has been, a little bit of tension sometimes between industry and academics or tertiary education in agriculture about what a job-ready graduate might look like versus an employment graduate might look like as well. So it's a way of being able to make some contribution to that discussion, and also be able to look at things like learning pathways and how it might link in with graduate training as well. And the other part that I really like is that often discussions about teaching in agriculture might happen at the level of the Australian Council of Deans of Agriculture. It's very strategic and high level. They are the peak body, but not necessarily amongst ourselves, and particularly across the other universities. You go to an ag conference, say in Australia, and they might have a session on education, And more often than not, it might actually be dealing with extension, which is great. I mean, that's a component of education, certainly with adults, not necessarily actually particularly targeting undergraduate education, which is more what this project is about. So it's been a fantastic opportunity to have some of those conversations as well. Okay, so when we say agriculture, why agriculture? Obviously agriculture is pretty broad, and we acknowledge that. If you look across the country, there's actually 14 universities and a few other ag colleges and so on who teach agriculture or related subdisciplines. So when we say agriculture, we're actually meaning it to be inclusive of things like viticulture or agribusiness or ag science, even horticulture. Animal science falls into this as well. So it is very broad level. And as I mentioned before, the focus is on learning outcomes. Now, this project started August last year, and I remember having this question at the time: are you going to start with a bit of a whisper, or are you really going to go for it? Now, in our case, we haven't had a lot of time to actually be able to get to the results that we handed out to you before. So we really had to have a good plan and then start to actually action the plan within a fairly limited space of time. Now, I've just sort of listed the main points that we went through here. So we'd already done this, looking at why we might be interested in standards and what some of the rationale were for actually taking this approach through the pilot project and through earlier discussions with the Australian Council of Deans of Agriculture, who were supportive of the idea. Then much of the actual activity in the project was very much linked to running workshops and talking with people in a very structured way, through using a mixture of quantitative and qualitative approaches, but also had a really strong link with engagement throughout the entire different stages of the project. That's been really important, and I'll demonstrate that to you in a moment. And then moving later on into the case studies, which I'll talk about towards the end of this. Now, just to highlight that, the communication in this project's actually been really critical, and it's meant that we've needed to be really on the front foot right from the get-go. We've had a website, and as you can see here, Phoebe's just put together some of the, the data associated with people actually visiting and looking at that. We've tried to link in with other websites around, this is the Australian Council of Deans of Science, for example, to be able to get exposure that way. We have newsletters in order to be able to get the information out to people. We've got 203 subscribers, so they get regular updates. We've been pretty active in terms of media broadcasts, ABC Country Hour, that again has been picked up in South Australia and other places, various newspaper and print articles. I've spoken a lot about this project over time, and that will ongoing. And then we've also had a few journal and papers as well. So that's been really important, because really this is all about communication and talking. So we needed to be out there and actually letting people know about the project and how it was going and what it was up to. So now I want to just move on to some of the methods that we've used, and it's very much been evidence-based. At the end of the day, we needed to be able to, take the information that we presented in that document that we've handed out about the Learning and Teaching Academic Standards statement and present it particularly to the Australian Council of Deans of Agriculture and say, well, here's our document, do you support it? In terms of supporting it, they're going to base it on evidence. It isn't about us just having a little chat and coming up with standards, which is what we could have done. It's just that it doesn't necessarily have the ownership of it. So what we've done is taken a route of qualitative and quantitative data. We've done various surveys. The whole team has been involved in workshops here and there throughout Australia. In total, we've had 291 people actually participate, and you can see several items of qualitative feedback that have actually gone into the development of the document. I'm not going to talk about project evaluation. Just to show you the type of question that we were consistently using in each workshop, because we needed people to be starting at the same point. We're particularly interested in what they considered the key attributes of agriculture to be. Okay, and then this has been used in developing the nature and extent of agriculture statement, and then also the threshold learning outcomes. What do people actually think a graduate should actually know, understand and be able to do? Now, just in this next couple of slides, this is just a framework that we've used to try and describe how the process of consultation and then the actual development of the standards by the project team has been undertaken. Now, what we've used here is actually linking it to cognitive skills. Now, if you're familiar with some of the I guess the educational literature, this is around Bloom, and some of you who have worked with that would probably recognise just the way that we've got these different characteristics. You can see that they're increasing in complexity, just as a way of being able to describe, I guess, the process that people actually go through in terms of talking with each other about how standards are important. And so it is a little bit of an artificial framework, but it gave us a framework to be able to basically, at the end of the day, explain how we reached a judgment about what should be in or what should be out of the standard statement. So obviously, even if it was just us here today, you know, the first thing that would be happening is you'd come in, you'd each have your own ideas about what was important when it comes to agriculture, okay? And it's through that communicating with each other that you might, you know, end up with different viewpoints coming into play and come up collectively at the end of it with a bit of an idea of what you collectively thought was important. So that's all that's just trying to capture there. How we were doing this was initially just with the universities directly involved in the project, okay? So they're just listed here. You can see there's various number of people participating in that. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of some of the feedback that we were getting, I won't read this out, I'll just give you a minute just to have a quick look through some of the comments. But these were fairly, you know, each person had their individual take, but these were fairly common comments that were coming through, that agriculture was considered to be multidisciplinary, for example. How important practical skills and training was regarded, okay? And then its nature was applied. And then on-the-job training was also really important. So some of these themes were consistently coming out in those comments that we pulled together. And the importance of communication, obviously, with agriculture. You need to be out there and talking to people, and it's not just one particular type of way of communicating, it's several different ways of communicating with people as well. Okay, to move on. Yep. We also did a survey. I guess one of the things with agriculture in particular, you might set up a workshop, and this is certainly our experience sometimes, and then people are really busy, okay, particularly if they're in agricultural industries, and they might not have time to actually be able to come along to a workshop and participate. So we also needed an alternative mechanism for people to contribute their ideas. And so we had an online survey through SurveyMonkey. It captured a whole range of, you know, qualitative information, but part of it was actually around looking at the initial types of threshold learning outcomes that could be included and getting some feedback on the relative importance of these. And you can see most of these are considered highly important, but the interesting one was around vocational knowledge, which was actually fairly similar in relation to what we'd seen with our own academics here just at UTAS and talking in that pilot project. It was really a bit of a mixed reaction. Okay, so, and I'll talk about that again in a moment, because we had to make some judgments then about whether to include that or not. Okay, so I showed you this part before. So this is just the actual process that the project team went through to actually draft the statement itself. So while we were running the workshops, obviously we were facilitating these, but we weren't, obviously, it was being able to talk with people and understand what they were thinking about. Oops, sorry, I've just lost my pointer. There it is. What they think about threshold learning outcomes, but without making any judgments, which is really collecting information. Preparing summaries, and then I had the job of actually taking all of that qualitative information and doing a fairly basic thematic analysis. We're taking different parts and basically organising them into different themes. And then we got together with Phoebe and I with the reference group in a bit of a marathon. I think it was a 5-hour meeting, wasn't it, to actually thrash out what might be the first form of this statement. And then ultimately the project team became involved in that as well, and actually trying to decide what a first draft of the nature and extent of agriculture and also the threshold learning outcomes might contain. Now at that point we had really, like I mentioned, just the first draft, and this is what it tended to try and capture. So again, we still had knowledge, understanding, problem inquiry based TLOs, communication and so on, and you can see those. But the one I'd like to highlight here is we actually made the decision that we weren't going to include vocational skills knowledge in the TLOs at that point. I mean, it was consistent with the kind of feedback that we were getting from people. And also we were of the opinion that it seemed to fit more into problem solving and inquiry-based work rather than as a completely separate TLO. And it certainly seemed to be consistent with what industry was saying as well. So I'll just leave that there for a minute. Now, I just wanted to have another look at some of I think the vocational knowledge skills area is quite an interesting one. I mean, we do regard ourselves as being a relatively applied discipline, so it's worthwhile just thinking about this in a little bit more detail. This is some of the direct quotes or statements that we were receiving from some of the participants of the workshops. And some people were quite adamant that actually they didn't want graduates to come out with vocational skills out of a university degree in agriculture. And other people emphasising the need to be able to implement theory. Okay, but on the other hand, some students are saying, well, actually, I do need some job-related skills in order to be able to get out there and be a consultant. So it is a little bit of a tricky area. Now, we've written a paper that's, I guess, gone through some of the process that we've undertaken in developing the threshold learning outcomes, but we've also use this question about vocational knowledge in order to explore it a little bit further. And just some things that we found, and some of these would be in common with other projects that have also used a similar approach. So one of the drawbacks of that first pilot project is it was a relatively small group of people who were involved in the development of the standards for agricultural science. One of the issues that can happen with a small group is that really strong voices can have a bigger influence on the outcome. Okay, so by being able to broaden out the consultation phase and bring in industry and also the students, that starts to get dampened down a little bit. Okay, and this is something that I know, for example, with ICT here in their curriculum redevelopment, they've been very deliberate as well in being able to go out and talk with a range of industry and students and so on in order to get a really unbiased view of their curriculum. So it's often a common issue. However, having said that, occasionally we would get people who had really passionate and really strong views about some aspect that they felt must be in the standard statement. And you do run the risk that if that, for whatever reason, doesn't end up appearing in the standard statement, that they won't actually value it as much as what somebody else would. Okay, it's sort of one of those unintended consequences. Now, and just returning to the vocational knowledge, we felt that by integrating it with inquiry and problem solving, that this was more appropriate to university level graduate standards. And it's interesting, actually, if you look at some of the literature around vocational education, particularly that's come out of the United States, and this is more at secondary level, but they were saying that initially it had this reputation almost as being very hands-on, tractor driving, the usual kinds of things that we hear bandied around when it comes to agriculture, unfortunately. And what they were trying to do was actually redirect some of that more knowledge and understanding to be more scientifically rigorous around agriculture rather than actually focusing on the vocational skills. And that's something that we see paralleled in our own experience in misconceptions almost about agriculture out in society, thinking that it might be one thing when it actually isn't. It's more about the science of agriculture, and that's a really important point to get across. Now, I guess the other one is that many of the agriculture degrees have a requirement for work experience or work integrated learning, and that's really important as well. It's where students get the opportunity to actually get out there and make professional networks and to actually apply some of the skills, and that is a really important part of these types of degrees, and it's something that we're highlighting in the document, not necessarily in what you've received here, but in a bigger version of it that I'll mention in a moment. And I think when it comes to talking about the employment versus job ready tension that it does appear sometimes, I think And I do appreciate, and it's something that's come out in speaking with a group from the Ag Institute once, was starting to understand that in smaller consultancy firms they could really see an issue in new students coming out to them and not necessarily having the skills that they needed in order to be able to go straight into the job and run with it. Compare that to, say, a bigger organisation that has, say, graduate employment programs where they do actually have the time and the space to be able to actually train up the graduates into exactly the kind of skills that they actually need. So I can appreciate that there's a tension there, but there's also that limitation in what universities can deliver. Okay? We're probably not going to be able to get to job-ready graduates. Okay. Now, so moving on from there, we also needed to move into the second phase of the project. So based on that initial draft of the AgLTAS statement, we then went back out to another range of universities that you can see here. We asked the same initial question because we were interested to see what they said, and then also presented the draft and said, okay, well, here's a draft, what do you think? And got feedback that way. Now, with that collated information, and including another survey just shown here, as you can see, obviously vocational knowledge and training's dropped out, and instead the remaining attributes are all mostly highly rated. Okay, so we felt like we were on the right track with the types of attributes that were included in the TLOs, and it came down to the nitty-gritty of actually writing the AgLTAS statement, which was, you can imagine, with 19 people needing to try and collectively draw together some 600 pieces of qualitative information, a little bit of a challenge. As you can see here, and this was just 4 of us having a bit of a crack at writing the statement, and as one of our reference group members noted, it at one point looked very colourful and a bit like a rainbow. So that was actually quite challenging because we needed to do that completely without bias and based on the evidence that was provided to us. And it was at that point that we felt that we'd been able to synthesise, make the judgments about what was in the standard statement, and then we presented that to the Australian Council of Deans of Agriculture in the document that you can see there, and they supported that on the 9th of April, which was wonderful. We've still got a little ways to go in order to actually have the full documentation. You can see here that we've got several of the starred items already finished. And just by way of explanation, we've also got some explanatory notes that need to be developed. And I think this is something where the academics who've been working with Phoebe and I recently in doing the mapping would appreciate that they haven't had the benefit of having explanatory notes in trying to do some of the mapping. It makes it really challenging because the question is, well, okay, you've written this TLO, but what do you actually mean when it comes to, say, an integrative understanding of agriculture? And in some ways what we've actually used is the mapping with the different project team universities to be able to inform the writing of the explanatory notes. So you've actually become part of the research project in effect. It will be, through you doing that, will actually make it much easier, say, when other universities then need to potentially do this, say UNE, because they'll actually have the benefit of all of your hard thinking about what these TLOs mean in being able to look at their own courses. The other thing that we need to do is actually map the standards just across other standards that are out there, just as a way of internally validating that we're on the right track. For example, here's just for the first TLO around an integrative understanding of agriculture. Here's AgLTAS. Here's the science standards. Here's the Australian qualification framework for a bachelor level, which is pretty broad and general, as you can see here. And this other one over here is the UK subject benchmark statement from the Quality Assurance Agency, okay, for agriculture and so on. And what we're looking for here is some similarities. So you can see here, for example, we've got explaining the role and relevance of agriculture. There you go. Agriculture in relation to science, and here's the same kind of concept over here. Whereas other parts are quite distinct. I won't continue on with this for too much longer, but you can see here that in these other ones we really highlighted agricultural practice and practice change, okay, and understanding how information is adopted. So that's really quite distinct from the science learning and teaching academic standards, and it's capturing something that we collectively value in agricultural education at university. Now there's some similarities with that over here in the UK, but the other the other thing is you really need to be able to see the whole document to see how this all maps out, because some parts appear in one different TLO and another part in a different criteria, so it moves around a little bit. But that just highlights some of the comparison and contrast of standards. Now, the next phase, and this is something that academics have been working with us on, is to actually start to map the threshold learning outcomes against our own courses and see what it looks like. Now, what we've got here is a curriculum mapping tool that we've taken from an initial project that, as I mentioned, Sue Jones and Brian Yates were involved with, and we've changed this so it's fully editable. So it makes it quite easy to use, and interestingly that's also been picked up by the university, who are looking at mapping assessments against the Australian qualification frameworks, which is great because it shows that you've actually got a tool that can be used for multiple purposes. And then in addition to that, like I said, our academic staff have been really lovely in being willing to become part of the work in actually helping us by completing pre and post workshop questionnaires to inform the development of the explanatory notes. So that's been a really important part of the project. So what I'll just do is just show you a few quick slides just about how the tool actually works, and actually show you the outcomes of that benchmarking. Just as a quick look, given that it was only really finished earlier this week actually. So what we've got here, this is just the interface when you first go in. In our case it's set up for the Bachelor of Agriculture and Bachelor of Agricultural Science. And then if we go into a unit, such here's ones for agronomy. Now the key point here is that we've got the various learning outcomes listed down here, the different sub-criteria. And the real question that we have to ask ourselves is whether we actually teach the learning outcome, and if you do teach it, do you actually assess it? Because at the end of the day, we need to demonstrate that we meet the learning outcome, and the only way you can do that is through the assessment. And so the question here is whether it's actually met or not. Okay, and there's various levels. For example, with the first year unit, you might be only meeting at the introductory level, which would be expected. Second year, intermediate level. And then for a graduate, you might actually only partially meet some of the learning outcomes. For example, there's a type of this here. So what's this to do with understanding agriculture? And this is about understanding biophysical, economic, social and policy drivers. And in thinking about the types of assessment that we do, we've got a plant breeding report, for example, and a very much independently driven project report that's being done with industry. But when it came to the assessment, we felt that it wasn't necessarily related to the economic and policy aspects of that threshold learning outcome, so it's only partially meeting that. But that's okay. Remember that we're actually going to map these things across the entire course. What you don't pick up in one unit, you might well pick up elsewhere. And that's certainly the case. Okay, you're not meant to be able to read all the detail here, not in any way, shape or form. We've got the 5 different threshold learning outcomes listed down here. Not surprisingly, okay, here's if the learning outcome taught, is it assessed? If it's assessed, does it actually meet the standard? And like I said, given that it's each component in each unit that goes through to actually make up this map, it's not surprising that a course would actually meet the assessment standards, and in some cases it actually exceeds it. Now this is all very well and gives you a quick look at whether a course actually meets standards or not, but when it comes to curriculum review and being able to use this in more detail, we actually need to map it out in a lot more detail than that. Again, ignore the detail down here, you're not meant to be able to read that, but what this is demonstrating for the Bachelor of Agricultural Science, here's the units going across here, admittedly just for the prescribed units, so I left out elective units completely here. Red, if a TLO is considered to be below graduate level. The orange is below graduate but at intermediate level, so often a second year type level. We've got some other aspects through here that are actually partially met, like I explained for that particular TLO with agronomy. In the green, that's a TLO that's actually met at graduate level, and in some instances we've got examples here where the staff believe that they are actually exceeding the requirement for that particular TLO. So just to have a little bit of a look through here, so we can see that in particular, so this whole section through here, for example, is to do with inquiry and problem solving. Now you can see in the Bachelor of Agricultural Science degree that this is often the bit that we seem to be believing that we meet fairly consistently across many of the different units in that degree. Other parts it's a little bit more empty. These blank ones are where it's neither taught nor assessed. Okay, maybe that's what you expect in a second year unit, because really you're trying to bed down some of the concepts there, okay, and then you go through and you teach it in more detail in third year. We've got some units, so this is KLA 311, this is crop protection, and you can see here that's actually ticking off in every single TLO. You know, it's a very integrative unit. It includes things to do with regulation. It needs to cover across a whole different range of different concepts. And others are very much more specific. KLA 310 rather, is research methodology. In talking to the unit coordinator, they felt that the students were actually expected to reach a really high level of achievement when it came to some aspects of problem solving and inquiry. But in others, obviously, this is a very stats-based unit, and well, they're not really talking about things to do with understanding agriculture. Okay, it's not the point of the unit. Other things like down here, this second one from the bottom is to do with regulatory frameworks. And you can see that only a couple of units are really ticking off on these. Is that okay? Probably. I mean, on the whole, we just need to be able to demonstrate that we're doing it in some way, shape or form. Okay. So this needs a whole lot more analysis, I think, with the academic staff to understand some of the patterns and how that might actually feed into curriculum review. And just quickly, here's also the Bachelor of Agriculture. Okay, so this is a 3-year degree. And again, I've done the same thing in that this does not include the elective units. So there's some different units in here, and it's maybe, well, my looking at this, and we've still got the strength in the inquiry and problem solving. Some other aspects seem to be a bit stronger in around understanding agriculture and some aspects of the communication as well. And given that this is often where we target our potential graduates maybe to be going off into consulting and some of those different activities, maybe that's appropriate. So that's something that we need to think about, or is there aspects in here that we actually need to strengthen further? And so this is the question that we need to start asking ourselves, given that we're in the midst of a curriculum review at the moment. But it's not just this data that becomes important with curriculum review, it's also looking at what actual types of content are offered where, okay, and also looking, unfortunately, at how some of the business case actually stacks up as well, and what we want our graduates ultimately to be able to be doing. So, anyway, so thank you. That was really that project in a nutshell. At the moment, I think University of Adelaide have also gone through the mapping, and we're starting to think about what how this might actually come together. I think we've raised a lot of questions amongst ourselves about what some of these threshold learning outcomes actually mean, and that'll be really useful for us in being able to finalise that document. And so watch this space. I guess we'll continue on in this and think about how it might impact on our own curriculum review as well. Okay, so thank you.